great to see everyone again. Our Unifor family gathered here in person to celebrate, recharge our energies, get ready for the fights ahead, to defend our members and push for gains for all working people. Thank you again, Leanne, and the rest of the BC Regional Executive and committees who helped plan this council under some pretty hectic times, and of course the many, many staff that are involved in this as well. I'd also like to thank the incredible welcome we just received from the Coastal Wolfpack dancers and the cultural ambassadors. And I too would like to acknowledge and reflect, ask all of us to reflect on the fact that we are meeting and working here today on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish Nation and Ilwat Nation. We have to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we have to dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I also note that these acknowledgements are but one small but necessary step on the path toward lasting truth and reconciliation, and that much more action is needed. So for those of you that attended our Constitutional Convention in August, you will probably have heard most of my report, but I'll try and keep it interesting, and a lot's been going on since then as well. It's been a very, very busy time since our last BC Council in 2019, and it's not an overstatement to say that the world has changed in so many different ways. We've been pushing governments on all levels on many important issues, from better health and safety to EI reform, for better pandemic programs, to anti-scab legislation, and continued organizing. The work never stops, and the pandemic never stopped us either. We've seen ongoing bargaining with some amazing results, innovative compromises, and real gains for workers. We've seen industries go boom or bust, and in many cases due to COVID. We've had Unifor strikes for justice and amazing victories and collective agreements involving workers in so many sectors. But even now, many workers are still facing layoffs due to the uneven recovery and the pending recession, and sectors like aviation, hospitality, and gaming struggle to fully recover and indeed may be forever changed. We also see some sectors like the courier industry where they are overworked. Workers are facing the pandemic and its lasting impact still head on. I know we've all been reporting online, we've had many leadership meetings and lobbying, but somehow seeing you all here today, it just feels much more real. So it's great to welcome you. This is our first official BC Regional Council since 2019. I also want to take a moment to welcome all of you here to Whistler and note that we have several special guests from Unifor's National Executive Board. Of course, we have here on stage our newly elected Secretary-Treasurer, Len Poirier. We have, thank you, Len. And I might forget someone, but I think I have it. Jennifer Murray, my counterpart from the Atlantic Regional Director, is somewhere, well, there she is, there's Jennifer. Derek Barry on the National Executive Board, representing our BIWAC members. Derek's in the room. And I believe Les McDonald, representing our retirees, is somewhere here in the room as well. He's on the board as well. And of course, last but certainly not least, and if I've forgot anyone, I'm sorry, but Lana Payne, our new president, will be here later tonight, and she'll be speaking to you tomorrow. And we also have, Matt Bloy from the National Executive Board, who is the Atlantic Regional Chairperson. There's Matt. And right beside him, we have Guy Deforge, who is the Prairie Regional Council Chairperson as well. So we also have a lot of changes. We have the new executive assistant to the president, Roxanne Dubois. She can't be here because she's at Quebec Council, which is going on at the exact same time. Sari Saarinen is here, our executive assistant to the Secretary-Treasurer. Where's Sari? Somewhere in the room? There's Sari. And of course, we have our new assistants to the national officers. Tim Mitchell is over there, I believe, yeah. And Katha Fortier is over there. And we also have Shane Work as well, so Shane. And then he's not in the room right now, and he's probably busy, but Mario Santos is the new BC Area Director. He's here as well. So we're here because we want to support all of you. We want to make sure that you get, there's Mario now, give him a round of applause. So anyway, thank you to all my colleagues from the NEB for making the trip, and thank you. It's very much appreciated here, and we've had a very, very busy year. I also want to say that Whistler is a union town. This is actually not just a union town, it's a Unifor town. And this, the hotel, the Hilton, and also the Ava is represented by Unifor Local 3000, and I see 3,000 folks right there. So they're working very hard with them, and many of our leadership in those hotels have worked here for 20 or 30 years. We are actually the biggest union in Whistler in terms of hotels, and of course we have our Whistler Transit members from 114 who do all the transit in the Sea to Sky region. Just as an example, at the kind of agreements that we've been bargaining, and Local 3000 and the staff have been bargaining, at the Hilton alone, we just wrapped up bargaining last fall and saw wage increases of 18.5% for the membership over the life of the agreement. So please make sure that you give the staff a warm welcome, let them know that we're Unifor, and remember to tip them well, and remember all of the do's and don'ts, which I believe are in your kits for dealing with hospitality workers. So as I said, we're making many changes, and with the new leadership team and senior staff, and I know I don't want to steal Lana and Len's thunder, so there's lots that they'll update you on, but I want to tell you one recent story about your newly elected leadership team and your new National Executive Board. So the very first meeting we had was just a little over 3 weeks ago. Of course, we've been meeting ad hoc, but it was via Zoom, and it was on a Sunday night. And I was actually in a taxi cab late that night, just coming in from Toronto, and it was actually a historic occasion. All weekend, Lana had been in touch with me and the rest of the leadership team, and she was on the phone with the leaders of many other unions to support the 55,000 Ontario education support staff who were under attack. These CUPE members worked in schools all across Ontario, and they've been trying to negotiate a new contract for some of the lowest paid education workers for months. As part of the bargaining, they were ready to begin a legally protected strike. But Premier Doug Ford reached for the nuclear button by not only legislating these workers back to work before they had even started their strike. He knew his law was illegal, and he knew it was contrary to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so he simply tried to wipe all of their rights away using his legislative majority. Workers, as many of you know, have a charter-protected right to strike and to organize. So Doug Ford decided to reach for the nuclear button, which is known as the notwithstanding clause. This is an escape hatch that allows the government to say, we know we're discriminating against people, we know we're breaking the charter, but we're going to do it anyway. The clause should never have been in the Constitution, and it wasn't even intended to be used at first glance before a court decision, and it should never be used against anyone, including organized labor, but we also have the power to fight back. So the labor movement had no choice but to act aggressively, and I'm proud to report that your union and your new president, Lana Payne, was at the absolute center of that. So on that Sunday night, as the first and only item of business for your NEB since the convention, and at the request of Lana, the Unifor National Executive Board voted unanimously to endorse all action necessary to get Doug Ford to stand down. There was no question this was going to be a fight for the ages, and we were rapidly heading for a general strike with a deadline of November 14th. I'm looking at Shane here because this was no joke. Our auto parts workers, our IPS workers had sent a message that they were there, and we were planning to shut down workplaces all across Ontario. So the following day, after that meeting, Lana appeared with dozens of labor leaders and Laura Walton from CUPE to celebrate the government backing down. CUPE President, National President Mark Hancock and his team came over to our NEB meeting with thanks immediately afterwards, and I'm proud to say Doug Ford blinked and the labor movement made him do it. So I know, Lana, yes, it's something amazing. So it's an absolute honor to be there. You know, we all come up through the ranks in various things, and you think about a general strike, but to actually be there when the highest body in the union makes that vote and is serious about it, it was just an honor to be there, and I was so proud of everyone on the NEB because there was no hesitation at all. Now, COVID. From the beginning of the pandemic, there have been daily requests from national reps, local union presidents, workplace health and safety committees on COVID safety protocols, safe return to work programs, entrance screening protocols, enhanced PPE requirements, contract tracing protocols, second stage work refusals, and unfortunately, fatalities, to name a few. I want to thank all of the Unifor Health and Safety reps for their hard work, including Sari Saranen, Vinay, Ken, Emil, and so many others, and to all the safety reps in all of your locals who had to really step up like never before. We've also shed a lot of tears in the past few years at the human carnage of the pandemic and the massive economic impacts on our members and their families. We held an online vigil in January 2021 to honor workers who died in the pandemic, including 3 from Unifor at that time, and unfortunately, many more since. The memories of these COVID heroes will never be forgotten, and we'll do everything we can as an organization in our power to protect them, to honor them, and to make sure that employers do not sacrifice health and safety of workers in the pursuit of profit. We can never forget how these essential workers went from heroes to having their pandemic pay cut. We can never forget the travesty of what happened in long-term care or the unnecessary carnage that occurred there. BC's workplace fatalities numbers continue to be grim, and we have seen 161 fatalities in 2021 alone. Vinay Sharma, our new National Health, Safety and Environment Director, will give more detail, and we'll have a moment of silence for the workers lost, but we can never forget and must always renew our struggle for better safety conditions. There's so much going on across the Western region. It's 4 provinces. Before I go any further, I want to thank Leanne and Guy, our chairs, and Mario Santos and Steve Kerrigan, Paul Mackay, the area directors for BC, Alberta, and Manitoba, Saskatchewan. I also have to give great thanks to Marilyn Romano, my assistant, and the team of support staff helping. I'm probably going to miss some, but Claire, Susie, Debbie Noseworthy, Laura Vickery, Graham Brown, Nelson, there's many, many more. So there's an entire team that puts this on, department heads, staff, liaison, and I just want to thank them before I forget. I get the privilege and honor to report out to you, but as always, it's nothing but a team effort. Now, before COVID hit, if you go back to 2019, the BC Council and many of you helped us in the federal election campaign in October 2019, which ultimately led to the minority government where the NDP held a balance of power over the Liberals. Now, due to that campaign, the NDP and Liberals have an agreement in place to lead to the end of scabs federally for strikes and lockouts by the end of 2023, and of course we need to make it sooner. A national dental plan, a national childcare plan, and much more. I was also appointed for Unifor at the request of the BC Tourism Minister Lisa Bear to the BC Tourism Task Force, along with Stephanie Smith, the President of the BCGEU. We were tasked with doing a review of the sector and producing a report within 3 months on how to distribute $50 million on emergency aid to the sector. Every single industry group was on there, from airlines to hotels to lodges, the skiing industry, buses, everything. We toured the province virtually and produced a report by the end of the year that recommended a doubling of the aid to the industry from $50 million to $100 million. We were fighting hard to protect workers from layoff, from recall rights, for extension of benefits, for real guarantees, and we got some meager language stating expectation of rehire to the businesses if they got the aid, but it did keep many businesses afloat. Now, the businesses were begging for paperwork to be reduced to just 1 page, while admitting that their reputation and treatment of workers deserved a thorough rethink, but then they had no new answers. Just give us money with no strings attached, and then give us some more. I still serve on that tourism recovery program, and I have to fight as they wax lyrical about the overwhelming need for temporary foreign workers, and it looks like the new government might be starting to listen. We recently had a meeting about ways to avoid exploitation of migrant workers while strengthening worker power, and is an area we'll pay close attention to. But at the start of COVID, we saw huge challenges for frontline workers, and our transit workers in the Lower Mainland had to fight layoffs, and we had to fight hard to save those jobs. More than 1,200 jobs were on the line for our members working under TransLink and Locals 111 and 2200, and we saved every last one of them. Layoff slips were sent out, but with combined effort, we managed to convince both levels of government to find an agreement on funding, which was $664 million, and not one transit worker lost 1 hour of work as a result of that. So thank you to everyone in 111 and 2200. I also served on many calls during the pandemic on the BC government's COVID-19 Industry Engagement Committee, which involved the CEOs of every major industry, Crown Corporation, and trade group in the province. There was about 50 or 60 people on there. I was only one of 3 Labour reps there, with the other being Laird Cronk, the president of the BC Federation Labour, and Stephanie Smith, president of BCGEU. We were vastly outnumbered by the business representatives, but nevertheless, the inclusion of Unifor shows how important our voices, your voices, are to this government. I'm proud that we were able to punch above our weight on those committees, and it was also really telling to see how outnumbered we are as workers and unions, even though we're the ones on the front lines. It's why we must constantly be in government's back, lobbying them, because the industry never stops, and of course the answer is being better organized and fighting harder than ever. We pushed hard for many things during COVID and finally managed to sweep the Western region on getting paid vaccination leave for all workers. We never stopped fighting on paid sick leave, and we ended up in British Columbia as one of the only provinces with 5 days of legislated paid sick days. Most provinces still have not made any permanent changes to the sick leave laws, even though 73% of Canadians clearly want more sick days. We also pushed federally to get the new 10-day federal paid sick leave law, and that finally comes into effect next month. The fact that we have paid sick days in BC at all is an achievement of our loud voices and many others, and most provinces just dithered and did nothing, and even the federal government delayed. And this is because of the pushback they face from employers, particularly pro-business lobby groups like the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses. Only 28% of them and other employers actually support the new sick days, and they're lobbying to try to get them taken away. And the large companies care less about high turnover. They're not willing to bear the cost of giving workers time off, and they fight ferociously hard to stop it. I'm sure many of you, even trying to get the paid sick days off, had all kinds of disputes with your employers. An absence of paid sick days can be devastating because workers are forced to make wrenching trade-offs between their health and their livelihood. So it still remains that as a result of your work, as a result of our lobbying and speaking out, arranging meetings, it is British Columbia where we can be the proudest of what we've done, and we have made a difference because a different government matters to our members. To state the obvious, women continue to be hit hard by the pandemic, with Indigenous and Black women, women of color, and women with disabilities being the hardest hit. Increased exposure to the virus, chance of layoff, caregiving burdens, and domestic violence are just a few examples of the gender dimension of the pandemic. It takes an average woman in Canada more than 15 months to make the same as the average man did in 12 months. We know the gap is even wider for women facing multiple and intersecting areas of discrimination. During this pandemic, Unifor's regional directors wrote to the premiers across the country and demanded action. And of course, EI improvements are critical too. Women who return from parental leave and are then laid off without enough time to accumulate enough hours for EI covering the layoff, or they return from layoff pregnant without enough hours to qualify for maternity and parental leave benefits. We're lobbying regularly for EI reform and a longer qualifying time where special benefits and regular benefits can be accessed within a period of time. It's also important to bargain domestic violence leave into our collective agreements, even if it is the law. The collective agreement can increase awareness and reduce stigma. Where there is a women's advocate, she can help navigate the member through the system and ensure supports are in place. And with federal pay equity legislation now in force, over half of Canadian workers will be covered by proactive pay equity legislation. But there's more work to be done federally to ensure the new legislation actually works, and of course provincially. BC is one of 4 provinces, alongside Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador, without either pay transparency or pay equity legislation. BC has one of the largest gender pay gaps in Canada, with women making, on average, approximately 20% less than men. So during the pandemic, I've been consulting with the Ministry of Finance on closing the gender pay gap by continuing to address systemic discrimination in the workplace and moving closer to equal pay for equal work through new pay transparency legislation, and we hope to see that new legislation soon. But sadly, we've seen retrenchment in so many areas protecting human dignity during and after this pandemic, and south of the border continues to horrify us with toxic divisions and vicious attacks on reproductive rights. We must be loud in our disdain for this decision by our neighbours, but we must also focus our energy and attentions on our own communities and governments to prevent the erosion of our rights here at home and to improve access to reproductive care. The Unifor Women's Department is launching a national campaign to support reproductive rights in Canada by demanding the federal government use its powers more effectively under the Canada Health Act to ensure equitable access to publicly funded sexual and reproductive health services in every province and territory. There is a recommendation on this important campaign in your kits, and I hope we can get dedicated support and for people to speak out loudly. Our Social Justice Fund continues to do important work, and I sit on the SJF board. Checks for women's shelters and food banks across the country will go out at the end of November. We will provide support, and this number might be higher, but we will provide support to 74 shelters and 50 food banks across the country. I also want to thank, he's not here, but our outgoing Unifor International Department Director, Mohammed Al-Sadi. He helps to oversee that fund. He's retiring early next year, and I want to thank Mohammed for all his work on behalf of our union. The BC Council has also been involved in a presentation to the BC Human Rights Commissioner about the rise in racism and hatred, in particular to frontline workers and Asian members of our community. We're continuing that engagement, and we know there's much more work to be done to combat hate and racism in our communities, but we were there making sure your voices were heard. The announcement here in BC about the grave sites, I don't want to call it a discovery, but the announcement about the grave sites at the Kamloops Residential School for the Kamloops Shawetmuk and elsewhere shook our members deeply, including the 114 bus drivers in Kamloops who drive there every day. Locals 114 and 10B and the National Union contributed to the First Nation, and the drivers wore their orange shirts in respect. TransLink was only going to allow drivers to wear the shirts for a week, while BC Transit was initially saying no, they can only have a ribbon. So we went straight to the Minister of Transportation, and we pushed hard to allow all public bus drivers across the province, union and non-union, to be allowed to wear their orange shirts for the entire month of June. So we spoke up not only for our members, but for all bus drivers in the entire province. Thank you. We've been continuing to lobby the government to make September 30th a provincial statutory holiday, but also to ensure it's not just a holiday, that resources and time are put aside to ensure that it's also a time of learning and reflection, not just another paid day off. Unifor and the BC Regional Council sponsored a powwow in Victoria recently on September 30th this year with the Songhees Nation. This was their first powwow in 20 years, and we had so many volunteers from Unifor locals who helped us. We handed out snacks and participants and drinks to all of the people there, and I'd like to thank Leanne Marsh and Gina Smoke and Nikki Lundquist and everyone who helped, and we were in the grand entry. As I said, the first powwow in 20 years, and there was over 5,000 people there. It was a tremendously moving event, and I'm very proud, and I want to thank all of you and your locals who supported that. In August, 8 skilled trades representatives from the Unifor National Skilled Trades Council were deployed to Merritt, and they helped to rebuild a community that was devastated by the fires and floods of 2021 and the mudslides in the Nicola Valley. They partnered with 35 of the University of Windsor Lancers men's hockey team and staff, the City of Merritt, and the First Nations Emergency Response Society of BC. The goal was to raise awareness of the injustices toward the Indigenous community, foster a positive relationship with the First Nations in the Nicola Valley, all in an effort to help restore faith and further the conversation on truth and reconciliation. The group paid their respects with a visit to the Kamloops Indian Residential School Monument and Sacred Site on the morning of August 27th. In the evening, they attended an opening ceremony at the Shillas Powwow Arbor, along with many Nicola Valley community members. Brother Dave Cassidy from Skilled Trades on the NEB addressed the community on behalf of Unifor. The Coldwater Avenue project completed a full basement renovation with a new fence surrounding the property. The Clark Avenue project helped with the demolition of an existing shed and a complete rebuild of a 9x12 shed, including crawl space installation. The 14-mile Ranch Corral project completed the corral and helped dig out the Bar FX ranch that had just been buried in the mudslide. So I'd like to thank Dave Cassidy, all of our skilled trades members, and the Lancers hockey team for their hard work on these projects here in our province. Now, the pandemic has only increased concerns about financial security and retirement. Nearly 1 in 4 Canadians now say the pandemic has affected their timeline to retirement, and they'll have to work longer to address the shortfalls. A critical component of the solution lies in continuing to improve Canada's public pension plans, since they provide crucial support to marginalized seniors. The increases to our CPP premiums that the labour movement fought for, it's a good thing to increase pensions to workers, yet the Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre want to stop workers from getting better pensions. I want to acknowledge the solidarity and support of all of our retired workers who participated in solidarity actions for locals that have been on strike and locked out. And we've seen some retirements in our national staff in BC over the COVID-19 period, and I'd like to thank them again. Some of them are here: Murray Gore, Kevin Hancock, Stu Shields, Sandra Bryce, Jim Dixon, and many, many others across the union who retired. So I'd like to thank all of our retired members and staff for their amazing service to our union. Now, we know the pandemic has played out in many different ways in politics and the economy, but the impact has always been profound. But despite it all, our locals, our staff, our team, you're negotiating tremendous collective agreements while dealing with incredible hardships. The hospitality and gaming sector, as I said, is still dealing with the effects of COVID lockdowns. There's a growing retention problem with our hospitality units, as many workers have left the sector entirely. But at the same time, we hear the industry groups and many employers complain publicly about a labour shortage and a lack of skilled and willing workers. Of course, from our perspective, we see this through a different lens. There's not a labour shortage, there's a shortage of good jobs. So we don't accept their flawed logic, and the traditional hospitality job before the pandemic was more likely to be non-union, precarious, low-wage, part-time, with few or no benefits. And as I said, we can and should do better, and this is a perfect time to push for it. In the airlines, the recovery is continuing, and the pandemic has sped up the move to automation by airports and airlines. After the new agreement was reached at Air Canada, it was ratified literally days before the pandemic hit, immediately to be followed by mass layoffs as the aviation industry lost 90% of its business because of the pandemic measures, while a skeleton staff remained at the airports. Air Canada was ambitious that COVID would be short-lived, started to reintroduce flights in the late summer, and of course any of you that traveled in the summer know the chaos as our members were ill-treated by irate passengers. And I had that experience as well. I went 3 days in Winnipeg where they lost my luggage, hundreds of bags everywhere, overworked staff. It was a very difficult time for all of them. And the road transport sector still reports a massive shortage of drivers in Canada. The concern is driving a truck is not an attractive lifestyle to many people. There's new technologies that they're installing, dash cameras and driver-facing and artificial intelligence programs, and many drivers have just left the industry completely. And added pressure, again, they're pushing for more temporary foreign workers to help them recruit and fill the seats. The road transportation sector, though, was maybe one of the only sectors where we saw an increase in membership during the pandemic. And actually, the road transport sector, and thank you, Krista Lee, there you are, they had a great meeting this morning. That sector is over 15% of the union's total membership. But meanwhile, despite the increase, our container truckers are still waiting for a rate review that's 2 years overdue while they fall behind. We achieved an excellent pattern agreement there in the middle of COVID, where we brought in fully employer-paid benefits for everyone. This was a first in the industry, and we forced back recently the federal government and the Port of Vancouver on the changes for forcing drivers to replace their trucks. So another victory there. We've been working in forestry with government officials from Labour, Advanced Education and Jobs Ministries on the changes pending through the old growth deferral process. We've been pushing for greater say in programs to support workers. We've made submissions to Vince Reddy's review of successorship in the forestry sector. We've published op-eds in many communities saying the government hasn't done enough to help forestry workers. We've, of course, lobbied the government for more access to fibre resources and raised concerns about the growth of a pellet industry in BC, which has few jobs and is non-union. I've recently been appointed by Forest Minister Katrine Conroy to a 1-year renewable term on the newly formed Forestry Worker Support and Community Resilience Council. That's a mouthful. But along with Jim Stanford, and this will coordinate activities to support all these different programs across the ministries, and our purpose is to advise the government on the implementation of the Old Growth Strategic Review recommendations, supporting forest workers and communities as they adapt to changes resulting from the new forest management system, and government's vision for resilient, thriving communities. In Budget 2022, we got $185 million over 3 years to provide coordinated and comprehensive supports for forestry workers, industry, communities, and First Nations who may be affected by these deferrals on old growth logging. So we will provide the Minister of Forests with our advice as to how to make sure that we can have the existing programs made better, developing new programs and other industries related to forestry workers and economic resiliency. We're going to need all of you to help to gather the input of our members in all locals to make submissions. Mark Holland from our research department is working with John Hawkins on developing more information on the pellet industry and what role government is playing. But there is some recent good news, although we're waiting to see the details on fibre access. The BC government just announced last week a new approach to provincial forestry agreements, which will lead to faster action on harvesting areas damaged by wildfire, provide more timber for mills, and set up faster reforestation through the leadership of First Nations. New wildfire salvage opportunity agreements will enable the timely, direct award of forest licenses to First Nations for salvaging timber damaged by wildfire. Streamlining the process to harvest timber affected by wildfire will support our mills by ensuring they can access fire-damaged logs before they degrade and while they still have commercial value. We've been pushing for members non-stop to get more fibre for our mills for years and at every meeting with government, but I also want to give a special shout out to Unifor Locals 10B and 1119 who recently lobbied through the Pulp and Paper Coalition on the fibre crisis in BC, and it's obvious that government is finally starting to listen to the serious challenges facing forestry workers and the need to act now before it's too late. Thank you. In mining, our Kitimat smelter, there's a lot of folks here from Kitimat, has gone through some major changes since the strike that they fought. They fought a very tough battle for a fair agreement, but they never backed down. Mario Santos has also been named our Director of Mining as well, and the mining sector held their first council while at convention in 2022. We are working with, and you'll hear from, the BC First Nations Energy and Mining Council, helping to sponsor a study, and we're contributing $25,000 with $20,000 from the National, $5,000 from the Council, on the impact of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. BC is the only province in the country that has legislated that into law, and so as part of that, they're doing a rewrite of all of the laws, and one of them is the BC Mineral Tenure Act to ensure Indigenous voices are heard and respected. If you can think about BC with the home of the gold rush, you could literally plant a flag and claim thousands of kilometers of territory, and obviously that's completely at odds with respecting our First Nations lands. So we've invited their CEO, Dave Porter, to come and speak to all of us, and he's going to explain this work and how we're helping provide good jobs for all in the sector while respecting UNDRIP and Indigenous lands we live and work on. So breaking down these barriers will help everyone and hopefully lead to more work for everyone. Now, the provincial election, Unifor members played a pivotal role to elect a minority government under John Horgan. The Unifor BC Council helped throw out the BC Liberals in 2017 after 16 years of their right-wing attacks. We were also, during COVID, heavily involved in the BC provincial election in October 2020, which, as you all know, led to the largest NDP majority in history. The final result left the BC NDP with 57 seats, the Liberals with 28 seats, and the Greens with 2 seats. We went after, seems like a forgotten person now, but we went after the BC Liberals leader, Andrew Wilkinson. BC Council sponsored a campaign. It included radio, print, digital, bus billboards. We called him out of touch, just like we did with Christy Clark, who we called a premier for the wealthy. And he resigned 2 days after the election, and now he's no longer even an MLA. So good work, everyone, on that. We launched a large digital lobby in the spring of 2021. We fought for stat holidays, paid sick days, card check certification, skilled trade certification, overhaul of employment standards. We met virtually with 14 ministers, the Premier, and had many meetings with MLAs also. We held lobbying sessions in person and virtually with over 50 MLAs and ministers, and we were successful in achieving mandatory skilled trade certification legislation as just one direct example of that work. But our work in these elections has actually helped our members in BC. We've seen increases to the minimum wage. It's $15.65 an hour. With inflation, that seems like nothing, but many of you will remember the days when 15 seemed an unattainable goal. We saw the liquor server wage rate eliminated, better health and safety regulations, including one of the only provinces that gave us presumptive coverage of COVID for work-safe claims, improved employment standards, and protection against contract flipping. After I said they announced our lobby, the compulsory skilled trade certification, that's going to be in 10 initial trades. And on childcare, in BC, there are now more than 8,000 $10 a day spaces in BC, and the province plans to add 4,000 more $10 a day childcare spaces over the next couple of months, bringing the total to 12,500 by the end of this year alone. The Childcare BC program reduced the average cost of childcare from $1,000 a month at participating facilities to $200 a month, saving families approximately $800 a month per child on average, and of course the work continues. So these are just some of the key areas where we've played a role. We continue to push for proper assistance for forestry workers, our fish harvesters, support for our hospitality members, a stronger labor code, better employment standards, organizing laws. We're nowhere close to being done. And we've seen progress in organizing, and each gain tells us there are more workers out there looking for our help. We've brought in Margaret Olal as staff to work with Simon Lau. Where's Margaret? Somewhere in the room? Sim? Welcome, Margaret. And we've had some organizing gains. I'm going to miss some of them, but in places like News 1130, up north in Kitimat with diversified transportation and Scarlet Security. And recently we put in an application for the new casino at Delta, which is tied up at the LRB, but we're pushing forward on that as well. We recently held an organizing summit this year in Winnipeg to discuss ways that we can ramp up our organizing efforts. And to name another positive result, after a massive campaign, the organizing department was successful in unionizing WestJet in Calgary and Vancouver. And I'd like to welcome into Unifor Local 531 WestJet and I congratulate the bargaining committee on achieving and ratifying their first collective agreement. We're now focused on negotiations for Toronto and busy organizing other bases, including Edmonton. I believe that the new leaders of Local 531 are in the room. There they are. Give them a welcome. We're very happy to have you. We also saw a large unit of 700 Garda security screeners at the Calgary airport. We liberated them away from Clack, and they've now joined Local 2002. So I'd like to thank all the staff and all of you who have worked on organizing campaigns. We have also a new organizing director, and he's going to give a presentation, Justin Naposki. Where's Justin? He's somewhere in the room. Maybe he's not. Okay. We're going to get a new organizing director after, anyway. So he's looking forward to meeting many of you. But it's up to all of us. It's up to all of us to support these efforts, grow the efforts, magnify the work by working hand in hand with our locals and organize like never before. We need to push for broader forms of organizing like sectoral bargaining so that we can organize and bargain across entire sectors like hospitality, container trucking, transportation, and many more. We're also involved right now in a gig worker consultation, which is undergoing with the BC Labour Ministry, and we'll be putting in a submission, and I'll be working with our community chapter, the Canadian Freelance Union, on that also. I've called for an organizing summit in our recommendations to focus our efforts, identify leaders, deliver training, and ramp up like never before. And I'm also recommending that we continue to make the issue of expanded organizing, including successorship, contract flipping, and sectoral bargaining, a key part of all of our lobbying and electoral efforts moving forward, and need to recognize that increased organizing is both a key challenge and a key opportunity for the BC region. But we've achieved another important gain in the past few months in BC to help organizing on this scale. As many of you know, I helped to organize my own workplace in 1998 using card check or single-step certification. Card check protects workers from intimidation that we continue to see as organizing ramps up. The NDP was in power at the time, and they had legislation that workers wanting to join a union simply had to sign a confidential card. And if they reached 55% of all the workers in the bargaining unit, the Labour Board would verify that and then issue a certification without the need for a further vote and sparing them from any threats from the employer. Of course, the employers don't like that, and when the NDP lost power in 2001 to the BC Liberals, they ripped up not only most of the Employment Standards Code, but they ripped out card check certification within 3 months of taking office. And of course, union certification rates went down, unfair labour practices went up, and we have waited over 21 years, and we never gave up fighting to get it back. So the BC Council and Unifor activists in BC were absolutely relentless, demanding that this law come back at no more than 55% as an urgent item. We met with Premier Horgan and his Labour Minister Harry Bains many times to echo this demand, but we also focused as a group on every minister and every NDP MLA many times calling for immediate action. So I'm very happy to report that I recently received a letter this summer from Premier Horgan telling us that card check certification was back at 55%, that the bill had passed and it would receive royal assent, and it became the law again on June 2nd of this year. Now, Premier Horgan also included a copy of that bill. He sent it to me, and he personally signed it to us in big black marker all over the front of the bill and said, "Gavin, now let's get organizing." So indeed we will. We've been offered that challenge. I sent that out to all of the locals because it's not my victory, it's all of our victory together. We all fought for it, we all deserve it. Now we got to take advantage of it. So I'm proud for everyone that pushed very hard on that, and now we just need to get organizing. The move to improve worker health and safety hasn't stopped. I mentioned some of that at the outset. BC Council Chair Leanne Marsh, Sari Saarinen and I met recently and last year with the WorkSafe BC Board of Directors, along with this year with the BC Nurses Union executives. We focused on the many reports where action still needs to be taken, including the Patterson report calling for an overall shift to a worker-centric model in everything they do. We also noted it's not enough to shift policy and people. We need updates to legislation and regulation to enshrine the worker-centric approach. We may be running out of time with this government, and the BC Regional Council Executive has a resolution in your kits recommending a major push in our lobby for next spring on safety, on getting major legislation tabled and done. There's more than enough reports and stats. It's time to get moving. Now, the BC board is actually one of the better boards, and there are some positive changes going on. COVID presumptive illness I've mentioned, but recent changes to the right to refuse. But we do need more permanent change now. You'll hear from Vinay Sharma, our new Director of the Health, Safety and Environment Department. He will walk you through where we started, where we stand, and what we need to do to push forward. And of course, BC Labour Minister Harry Bains will be here speaking to us tomorrow, and he'll update us on some of the changes as well, but there's a lot more work to be done. Now, recently I joined the Unifor National Executive Board members last week, in Ottawa, personally lobbying all of us to move the anti-scab law along faster with stronger protections for workers. That NEB lobby involved over 40 participants, and we completed over 110 meetings with members of Parliament and staff. Jagmeet Singh held a breakfast reception with MPs for all of us, and we met with many ministers as well. In addition to moving the anti-scab process faster, we pushed for EI reform now, measures to deal with the affordability crisis, and for real funding and a real seat at the table to provide a real just transition for workers affected by economic transformation. It's critical that we win these battles nationwide, federally, and in each province, and Unifor will get it done. I spoke and helped open our recent successful 2022 EI CPP conference in Port Elgin, September this year, and that was over 90 participants from across the country. Some of you were there for that. The temporary EI improvements that the federal government brought in during COVID, ironically and sadly, expired the same weekend of that conference in September. I met with Pierre Laliberté, who is the Commissioner for Workers at the Canada Employment Insurance Commission, to discuss our campaign, and last week met with the Minister responsible for EI, Minister Carla Qualtrough, along with the rest of us, and Lana was there as well. Our NEB lobbying team had EI reform raised in every single one of those 110 meetings. We hope to see some improvements soon. We believe we're going to see some improvements soon, and we're watching the spring 2023 federal budget closely. Now, workers across the country and in BC have experienced firsthand the devastating impacts of a warmer climate. We've seen record floods, wildfires, and other forms of extreme weather causing untold suffering. We saw a heat dome, and the town of Lytton burned to the ground. With Canada currently warming twice as fast as the global average, these negative impacts on our communities are forecast to worsen, and the pressure on governments to respond rapidly to the crisis will only increase. As the largest union in the private sector, many Unifor members are on the front lines of the challenges posed by climate change, whether in the form of direct risks to their health and safety or potential threats to job security by climate policies that aim to decarbonize the Canadian economy. I've served on the BC Climate Solutions Task Force, which helped advise on the launch of Clean BC, and Joey Warnock did after me. Even under an NDP government, that task force was stacked with academics, environmentalists, corporate interests, good people, but they're people they reported to, and they weren't necessarily our members. When we were at those tables, we made sure your voices were heard loudly, and while we spoke as actual leaders of working people, not simply an environmental group with an email AstroTurf list. But the meetings are going on everywhere. Your corporations are meeting with each other. They're meeting with government. They're trying to manage the narrative to their benefit. And the environmentalists are divided between realistic and warp speed ahead. But who is making sure that the workers are protected? We're going to keep fighting to protect important jobs with pensions, benefits, and unions while preparing and adapting to the climate challenge. Sari Serna is here. She was just at the COP meetings, the UN meetings in Egypt, and there was a whole team there pushing as well. We're going to continue to push governments to focus on the difficult transitions, but making sure that workers have a real seat at the table. And that was one of the key topics that I raised with many of the National Executive Board members in Ottawa. I also held a press conference a few weeks ago with NDP MPs Charlie Angus, Heather McPherson, and Blake Desjardins, calling for that real seat at the table. We followed that up with meetings in Edmonton with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, with the Alberta Federation of Labour and other unions to push the same points. We've made it clear that we're not against changes needed to meet our climate targets, but governments and businesses must commit significant funding to protect good jobs, provide supports, including skill training, job guarantees, pension bridging, and more to ensure no one and no communities left behind. The threat caused by climate change and the need to change is a societal transformation, and no individual worker and no individual community should bear the cost of that because it's something that affects all of us. So Unifor has begun the work of launching a national climate task force. You heard that at our convention. And the intention is to keep track of the climate-related issues and all of these policies while developing strategies to protect jobs and provide concrete tools and supports. This task force will be a pivotal, crucial pivot around which our members can make sure their voices are heard. The Health, Safety and Environment Department is in the early stages of planning for a 2023 Unifor National Just Transition Conference, and all indications are that the federal government will be releasing critical legislation on this in early 2023 with the budget. Now, we have media workers in the room. Media workers have been more targets of more violence and abuse recently. Our members in the media sector are victims of this abuse for simply doing their jobs. At Global TV, the company has actually removed the company logos from some of their vehicles, and they're in the process of removing them from all the vehicles, because these branded vehicles have not only made our members targets on the job, but also at their homes. This behavior is not acceptable, and Unifor condemns this behavior, and we stand with all journalists here and abroad against violence and harassment. I know Jennifer Moreau, I see her back there, has been doing great work with the International Federation of Journalists, and it's critical because this issue isn't going away and it must be dealt with. So there's a recommendation from the BC Council Executive on this campaign in your kits, and I hope we get some speakers and strong support for this important work. Now, after the federal election, the Unifor called on the Liberals and the NDP to work together to benefit workers, but anti-scab legislation was critical. I met with Jagmeet Singh virtually many times after that election and made it clear where Unifor stood with anti-scab legislation, very, very high on the list of immediate items we sought. Now they've announced recently that they're going to bring that law in by the end of 2023. And we support the commitment, but we know the real urgent need is for anti-scab protections right now. Workers cannot wait until the end of 2023. We're moving into major bargaining with our CN and CP rail workers. We've got aviation bargaining. We've got all kinds of industries where there could easily be a dispute and they could bring in replacement worker scabs before the end of 2023. So we're asking them to make a move that scabs should be outlawed today in every province and in every jurisdiction. It's actually critical to our success at each and every bargaining table, and bargaining where your job isn't immediately outsourced is a recipe for safer picket lines and more respectful bargaining for all. We do have anti-scab protection provincially in BC, but it needs to be improved, and the same thing in Quebec. But we're this close to getting it, and it's Unifor that's leading the charge on all of that. And we've had important strikes and lockouts in BC over the past few years. We had a dispute up at the Pine River gas plant up near Chetwynd with Local 449. As I mentioned, we had that large dispute with Rio Tinto and Kitimat with Local 2301. I think it lasted about 100 days and even longer with the impacts. We had a dispute at NVI Mining in Campbell River with Local 3019 and at Ocean Concrete in Victoria with Local 114. And we also saw the longest transit strike in BC history occur right here in Whistler with our Local 114 members at Whistler Transit shutting down all transit in the Sea to Sky region for 140 days. We'll have the mayor here tomorrow. We gave him a bit of grief when we were here, but those workers stood strong, got an excellent collective agreement, and actually set the bar for inflation protection. So congratulations to all the workers in 114. And by the way, we have transit bargaining coming up in 111 and 2200, so please don't take that challenge for the longest transit strike as something you need to duplicate. So let's get a contract. And contract flipping is an area where an employer loses a contract and rehires the same employers at the successor company to do the very same job that those employees did for years, but without any consideration of seniority, vacation pay, or benefits. You have to start at the bottom every time that happens. As many of you will remember, years ago we lost 150 members at Cadillac Fairview who worked for Cervantage. Their job was flipped to some other union that had a deal that was about a quarter above the minimum wage. Our members were several dollars above minimum wage. They had benefits. They all lost their jobs. They all had to start from scratch again. So we managed to get change in 2017 in labour legislation in BC, protecting workers from contract flipping, covering transit, security, and building cleaning sectors. So although progress has been made, that's only a small list of sectors. We need to outlaw it everywhere. It's also a key concern in the federal sector, not just in aviation, and it's used in many other industries to keep wages as close to minimum wage as possible. We've seen companies like WestJet openly move in places like Comox to contract flip in order to get away from unionized contract as part of a deliberate strategy. As a result of previous campaigns on contract flipping, the federal government stated in their 2021 budget their intention to bring in legislation that protects workers who are the victims of contract being retendered. We need to ensure they follow through on their intentions. So I have a recommendation in your kits about contract flipping to encourage all locals to support lobbying the provincial and the federal government for creating legislation that protects and expands workers who should retain their union and their contract when contracts are retendered. Via rail. I see Jennifer Murray is in the room, and I know there's folks that are following Via Rail. I want to congratulate them for the amazing agreement that they bargained earlier this year with Via Rail. Our committees worked so hard. The members supported them with huge strike mandates, and they were more than ready to hit the bricks. But workers at Via are putting forward a vision for a strong, well-funded public passenger rail service in Canada, and we've launched a national campaign to oppose privatization efforts in any part of the rail network. Because we need to grow, not cut. We need to keep it public, not sell it off to greedy corporations. So despite the new collective agreement, that thread isn't over. We held a rally in Winnipeg recently at the Prairie Regional Council, and we need to continue to support this important campaign. So we've launched Get Canada Back on Track as a joint campaign of the National Union and Council 4000, Local 100, and there's a recommendation for us to continue to strongly support that campaign. Recently, internationally, I got the honor to go to our Mexican Workers' Rights Project in Mexico City, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but essentially, we've been out there fighting against yellow dog unions in Mexico and fighting for real workers to have a voice. And at the GM plant, they managed to get that done, and I was pleased to go down there with Mohammed and speak to the workers down there and the incredible work they're doing on the ground. Unifor is playing a key role in that, and I'm very proud of all the work we've been doing there. Now, of course, while we've been dealing with the COVID tragedies here and the huge economic dislocation as a result, in other parts of the world, people are being bombed. Hospitals are targeted. Civilians are dying. And there's over 4 million refugees. Conventional war has now reared its ugly head again, and I hate to even call it war. It's an unprovoked, unjustified, undignified assault and an invasion of a free country using all the hate of war. The guns and drums and guns of war, missiles, drones, artillery strikes, air raid sirens, civilian casualties in malls, homes, apartment buildings, on a scale not seen in Europe for over 70 years. I spent time in Northern Ireland during the Troubles as a child, and I know what it's like to see APCs on your street, seeing choppers fly overhead, soldiers on the street with huge guns, guard towers and checkpoints, and the fear and sense of dread felt by the population. It's so much worse today in Ukraine, and indeed in many places around the world, including Myanmar, Hong Kong, Brazil, many other locations. Indeed, the events of the past few years show that even the United States can succumb to irrationality and hatred. It's like taking those pictures of the rubble in Berlin at the end of World War II and superimposing them on 2022 society. Same rubble, different debris and clothing, but human suffering all the same. There's no such thing as a foreign war. Many Canadians have their roots in Ukraine, and they still have their families there. When a major power such as Russia invades another country, the resulting instability threatens us all. And of course, we've seen the impact on inflation as well. Because working people bear the brunt of any war. They're the ones sent into battle. Their neighborhoods and war zones are left in ruins. Families are devastated, even far from the front lines, as sons, fathers, daughters, mothers are sent into battle, never to return or returning broken. With the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, working people are paying that price again. Unifor condemns this invasion, and we express our deep concern that further escalation of military conflicts will bring the world to the brink of war with enormous humanitarian consequences. Within a week of the invasion, Unifor issued a statement, a letter of solidarity with Ukrainian journalists, and a media release about donations to the Red Cross. Unifor began by donating a total of $150,000 to the Red Cross to assist with its efforts to help the people of Ukraine following the Russian invasion. That was $100,000 from the Social Justice Fund, $25,000 from the National Union, $5,000 from each of the regional councils. And I'm proud to announce that that fund, that Ukrainian Red Cross Fund, I just checked, is now over $525,000 that we have donated. So the Social Justice Fund exists for exactly that reason, to lift people's lives, and helping the people of Ukraine fits perfectly with that. So Unifor locals and members can continue to donate to that fund with their donation to the Red Cross, and in every conflict, the Red Cross is a beacon of safety. The Red Cross Society has scaled up efforts to meet urgent needs across the country. So that money will be used to respond to humanitarian needs and prepare them for the heightened tensions. Russia is continuing to bomb civilian targets and electrical infrastructure, even today, and Ukrainians will suffer even more as the winter approaches. More help is needed, and today I'm calling on us to do more collectively. You'll see a recommendation in your kits that the BC Regional Council pass an immediate additional donation of $25,000 to the Red Cross to support Ukrainian refugees, and I hope we'll get strong support for that recommendation. The BC Regional Council and its members marched in the Vancouver Pride Parade again this year, and for the first time since 2019, and thanks to Danny and Krista Lee and all the others who helped put that on. The BC Regional Council also sponsored over 1,500 members to attend the Vancouver PNE this year. We had Unifor bags, t-shirts, free entrance passes, draws for kids' bikes, a barbecue, and tons of volunteers from many locals, and I would like to thank them all again for that. I was also happy to hear from our new Premier David Eby this summer before he was planning on announcing his run for the BC NDP leader. I told him he was always someone we respected and we wanted to make sure he understood our key issues. I invited him to join us on Labour Day, and he did, along with BC Labour Minister Harry Bains, Environment Minister George Heyman, the Mayor of Vancouver, and municipal election candidates. I've been quite concerned to see how the leadership race unfolded recently, with a single-issue candidate disqualified for breaking the rules and colluding with Dogwood, an environmental group. And even though David Eby has the overwhelming support of the NDP caucus by a huge majority, this group was allegedly able to sign up more members by using this third party to help. And as important as strong action on climate change is, it's concerning that a single-issue group nearly took over as Premier. This would have led to a public backlash, dropping support for the NDP, and the very likely return of the BC Liberals, who are now calling themselves BC United, like some kind of third-ranked soccer team. It's a sign that we can never take our NDP majority for granted, and we must work hard to stay active on the ground. I was honoured last week to be able to thank outgoing Premier John Horgan on behalf of Unifor to function in Ottawa, and I attended last week on behalf of Unifor the swearing in of our new Premier David Eby on the Musqueam territory the same week. I believe we're going to need to lead a large lobby over to Victoria next year to bring our demands to the new government. Many of the staff and positions will be changing. David Eby will be a great Premier, but we need to make sure he understands how important it is to act on Labour's concerns, ensure that we have a real seat at the table, and be bold in governing as the challenges and affordability crisis are so critical to so many. I know the BC Council is up to the task, and I look forward to working with all of you on an important lobby next year in person. Finally, as you know, we just completed our national convention and the new leadership team in place. Lana Payne, Len Poirier, Daniel Cloutier, Jennifer Murray, Noreen Risby and I are the new leadership team, and we're planning many changes. Our members were clear that they wanted change, and we will deliver while making sure the important work of our union and our members moves forward. As I mentioned, Mario Santos has been named the area director, and there'll be many more changes to come. We're going to be consulting you on many things, including our commitment to explore rejoining the Canadian Labour Congress, and work is already underway on that file. And we hope to be able to bring a recommendation to the Canada Council in Halifax next year for all of the members to have the say on that. And again, we're working on that. I know Lana and Len will have a lot to report on in terms of other changes that are going on, so I'll leave it there. But again, there's so much work to be done. So I'd like to thank everyone for all of the work and everything that you do. As I hope I've captured just a little bit, we have so much to be proud of as Unifor in BC, and all the BC locals were very engaged and active in our recent convention, on the many committees, on the floor, industry councils and events. We know there's nothing automatic about safety in workplaces, fair wages, equal treatment, gender and racial equality, and income security. These aren't benefits bestowed on us by benevolent employers or governments. Workers must strategize, organize, and fight for what we need, just as we've done for generations. The benefits we enjoy today are a product of our forebears who dared believe a better world was not only possible, but within reach. And that includes the formation of Unifor itself. It was an act of hope and transformation from the Canadian labour movement, an effort to reassert the power that workers wield in society and the positive influence of trade unions in the economy. Is it any surprise that efforts to rebalance the scales of economic prosperity, everything from demanding that the wealthiest pay their fair share to greater access to affordable public services, it's met with aggressive opposition by conservative politicians, private corporations, and the most affluent society? The fact that in 2020, all of the world's 2,153 billionaires have more wealth than 60% of the world's population of approximately 4.6 billion people. This is one devastating consequence of this. But as I said, today workers are organizing in places once thought impossible to organize. At Amazon, at WestJet, in office towers, coffee shops, on farms, in the gig economy, in some of the most repressive places for unions on earth, and Mexico is one example of that. In the United States, where unionization rates are among the lowest in the world, public favor toward unions has hit highs not seen since 1965. In Canada and elsewhere, a renewed sense of militancy among workers in the face of lingering workplace safety concerns, chronically low wages and high inflation, is inspiring others to demand better from employers and to hit the picket lines if necessary. In 2020, more workers in Canada were involved in labour disputes, strikes and lockouts than at any point since 1976. And I believe the stats show that we had more strikes in Unifor in the last year since the founding of Unifor, and we're on track to exceed that again. So this rise in worker militancy is not a surprise. It's a response to decades of stagnating wages, a rise in precarious work, persistent gender pay gaps, and slow-moving progress on improving employment standards, among other challenges. And of course, we now know the rising cost of living and rising consumer prices are swallowing most workers' wage gains. Lana has called the recent moves by the Bank of Canada class warfare on workers, lecturing corporations not to give workers wage increases while mentioning nothing about the obscene corporate profits that are out there. And they got as high as 25% of GDP. They only ever got as high as 15%. So as of March 2022, our wages, even though we're getting good agreements, only rose at half the pace of inflation. And we're fighting back. I know all of you are at the bargaining tables every day. Most workers lack the savings or social programs to be without work, even for brief periods, creating a desperation that tethers them to bad employers. Deep-rooted inequities faced by women, workers of color, and workers with disabilities continue to reproduce bad jobs and limit opportunities for large segments of workers. And as I said, at the same time, large corporations are reaping the benefits. As one of Canada's largest and most influential unions, union has a special role to play, and we will continue to speak out. We'll not be silent, no matter who it is that's holding us back. All politicians must learn some important things about Unifor and our members. We are strong. We are proud. We can fight back, and we will fight back. If you want to be our friend as a politician, a commitment to anti-scab legislation has to be a starting point. A commitment to improve organizing laws and repealing anti-worker laws everywhere is another. Protecting and respecting workers, their safety, and the most vulnerable among us has to be a concerted effort, and we will not be satisfied with tokens. We need change. Our equity and justice demands, they're not mere words, they're calls to action, and we insist on action, not symbols. And although we've all been through the fire together and back these past few years, we're emerging from this stronger than ever before, because we can see a better world, we can win together, we can continue our commitment to our ideals and vision, and we will grow like never before. Thank you very much, everyone, for your important work. Solidarity.